The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that made the world feel empty. Ethan Carter, a retired firefighter, was driving his truck along a deserted highway. His German Shepherd, Max, sat in the passenger seat, alert and watchful as always. The road stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by the dim glow of the truck's headlights. Ethan had always found comfort in these late-night drives, but tonight, something felt off. Without warning, another vehicle swerved into their lane. Ethan barely had time to react before the impact sent his truck spinning out of control. The world turned upside down as the truck flipped, the sound of crunching metal and shattering glass filling the air. When the vehicle finally came to a stop, Ethan was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious and bleeding. The cabin was filled with the acrid smell of gasoline and smoke. Max, though dazed and bruised, managed to free himself from the wreckage. He circled the truck, barking frantically, trying to rouse Ethan. But his owner remained unresponsive. Max's instincts kicked in. He knew Ethan was hurt, and he knew he had to find help. With one last look at his owner, Max took off into the night, his paws pounding against the asphalt. Max ran along the dark highway, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The road was eerily empty, and the occasional passing car ignored his desperate barks. Max didn't stop. He couldn't. Ethan's life depended on him. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. By the way, what city are you watching us from? Write it in the comments, we're curious. After what felt like an eternity, Max spotted a police car parked on the side of the road. Inside, Officer Luke Reynolds was finishing up some paperwork, his mind preoccupied with the quiet night. Max approached the car, his barks sharp and urgent. He pawed at the door, then tugged at Luke's sleeve through the open window. At first, Luke was startled. He had never seen a dog behave like this. But Max's eyes told a story, one of desperation and fear. Luke hesitated for only a moment before realizing that this wasn't just a stray dog. Max was trying to tell him something. The officer quickly got out of the car, and Max immediately began leading him back down the highway, his tail stiff with urgency. Luke followed Max, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The dog moved with purpose, occasionally looking back to make sure the officer was still behind him. When they reached the scene of the accident, Luke's heart sank. The truck was overturned, its frame twisted and broken. Ethan was still inside, unconscious and bleeding from a deep gash on his forehead. Max ran to the truck, pawing at the door and whining. Luke quickly assessed the situation and called for backup and an ambulance. He tried to keep Max calm, but the dog was frantic, refusing to leave Ethan's side. When the rescue team arrived, they worked quickly to free Ethan from the wreckage. Max watched every move, his eyes never leaving his owner. As Ethan was loaded into the ambulance, Max tried to follow, but the paramedics gently held him back. Luke assured Max that Ethan would be taken care of, and the dog reluctantly allowed himself to be led to the police car. The ride to the hospital was tense, with Max sitting in the back seat, his ears perked and his body rigid with worry. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to leave Ethan's side. When they arrived at the hospital, Max was allowed to stay in the waiting area. He sat by the doors leading to the emergency room, his gaze fixed on the entrance. Every time someone walked by, Max's ears twitched, hoping it was Ethan. The hours dragged on, but Max didn't move. He would wait as long as it took. Ethan had always been there for him, and now it was his turn to be there for Ethan. The hospital was a whirlwind of activity as Ethan was rushed into the operating room. Max, still covered in dust and dried blood from the accident, waited outside the doors, his eyes fixed on the entrance. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Nurses and doctors moved quickly, their faces serious and focused. Max could sense the tension, and it made him restless. Inside the operating room, the surgeons worked tirelessly to stabilize Ethan. His injuries were severe, broken ribs, internal bleeding, and a head wound that required immediate attention. The cost of the operation was staggering, and when the hospital staff checked Ethan's insurance, they discovered it wouldn't cover the procedure. The news spread quickly, and the staff began to worry about how they would proceed. Meanwhile, Max, sitting in the waiting area, began to whimper softly. He could feel the anxiety in the air, and it mirrored his own. A nurse, noticing the dog's distress, knelt down to comfort him. Max nudged her hand, his eyes pleading. It was as if he was begging her to save Ethan. The nurse, touched by Max's loyalty, decided to share his story with the hospital staff. Word spread, and soon, donations began pouring in from people who had heard about the brave dog and his injured owner. The hospital was able to proceed with the operation, thanks to the generosity of strangers. The surgery lasted nearly 6 hours. Max remained by the operating room doors, refusing to move. He sat with his ears perked, his body tense, and his eyes never leaving the entrance. Nurses and doctors passed by, offering him water and gentle pats, but Max barely acknowledged them. His focus was solely on Ethan. Finally, the doors opened, and the lead surgeon stepped out. Max immediately stood, his tail wagging faintly. The surgeon smiled and gave a reassuring nod. The operation had been successful. Ethan was stable, though still unconscious. Max was allowed to see him briefly, and the dog's tail wagged furiously as he approached the hospital bed. He sniffed Ethan's hand and licked it gently, as if trying to wake him. Ethan's fingers twitched, and Max let out a soft whine, his eyes filled with hope. Over the next few hours, Ethan began to regain consciousness. When he finally opened his eyes, Max was there, his tail wagging so hard it shook his entire body. Ethan, though weak and groggy, managed to smile. He reached out to stroke Max's head, whispering, "Good boy." Max leaned into the touch, his relief palpable. As Ethan began to recover, Officer Luke Reynolds visited him in the hospital. Luke had been investigating the accident and had some troubling news. The brakes on Ethan's truck had been tampered with, and the crash was no accident. Ethan's heart sank as he processed the information. Who would want to hurt him? And why? Luke explained that he had been looking into a recent case involving a massive fire that had destroyed a warehouse. A key witness in the case had died in the fire, and the investigation had stalled. The witness had been linked to Lieutenant Eric Dawson, a high-ranking officer accused of corruption. Luke suspected that Ethan might have unknowingly witnessed something related to the case, making him a target. Ethan's mind raced. He remembered the fire. It had been one of the last major incidents he had responded to before retiring. He also recalled that the brakes on his truck had failed suddenly, just before the crash. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture was still unclear. Ethan and Luke agreed to work together to uncover the truth. Late one night, as Ethan lay in his hospital bed, Max suddenly stiffened. His ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Ethan, still weak but alert, noticed the change in Max's behavior. Before he could react, 2 men in black suits entered the room, claiming to be maintenance workers. Max immediately positioned himself between the men and Ethan, his teeth bared and his growls growing louder. One of the men reached into his jacket, but Max lunged before he could pull out a weapon. The dog knocked the man to the ground, his teeth clamping down on the man's arm. The second man tried to intervene, but Ethan, summoning all his strength, grabbed a nearby 4-stand and swung it at him. The commotion alerted Luke, who was just down the hall. He rushed into the room and helped Ethan subdue the intruders. A quick search of the men revealed a phone with a message ordering them to retreat. It was clear that Ethan was still in danger. Luke assured him that he would increase security and continue the investigation. Max, still on high alert, stayed close to Ethan, his eyes scanning the room for any further threats. The attack had shaken Ethan, but it had also strengthened his resolve. He knew now that he couldn't back down, not until the truth was uncovered and those responsible were brought to justice. The attack on Ethan in the hospital room was the final piece of evidence Luke needed to move forward with the case. The two men in black suits were taken into custody, and under interrogation, they revealed crucial information. They admitted to being hired by Lieutenant Eric Dawson to silence Ethan, fearing he knew too much about the corruption case tied to the warehouse fire. The men also provided details about Dawson's involvement in sabotaging Ethan's truck, confirming that the crash had been a deliberate attempt on his life. Luke worked tirelessly to gather enough evidence to bring Dawson in. He coordinated with his team, securing warrants and preparing for a high-stakes operation. Meanwhile, Ethan, though still recovering, provided Luke with every detail he could remember about the fire and the events leading up to it. His testimony, combined with the evidence from the attackers, painted a damning picture of Dawson's corruption. The arrest was swift and calculated. Luke and his team surrounded Dawson's home in the early hours of the morning, catching him off guard. Dawson tried to resist, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. As he was led away in handcuffs, Ethan watched from a distance, a sense of relief washing over him. The man who had tried to destroy his life was finally facing justice. With Dawson behind bars and the investigation concluded, Ethan could finally breathe easy. His recovery continued, and he was eventually discharged from the hospital. Max, who had never left his side, was there to greet him as he stepped outside for the first time in weeks. The fresh air felt invigorating, and Ethan took a moment to appreciate the simple joy of being alive. The community rallied around Ethan and Max, celebrating their courage and resilience. News outlets picked up their story, and donations continued to pour in, helping Ethan cover his medical expenses and get back on his feet. Max, now a local hero, was showered with attention and affection wherever he went. Children asked to pet him, and adults marveled at his bravery. But to Ethan, Max was more than a hero, he was family. Ethan and Max returned home, their bond stronger than ever. They spent their days rebuilding their lives, one step at a time. Ethan took long walks with Max, reflecting on everything they had been through. He often found himself marveling at the dog's unwavering loyalty and courage. Max had not only saved his life but had also helped bring down a corrupt officer, proving that even the smallest acts of bravery could have a profound impact. One evening, as the sun set over their quiet neighborhood, Ethan sat on the porch with Max by his side. He scratched behind Max's ears and smiled. "We made it, buddy," he said softly. "Thanks to you, we're going to be okay." Max wagged his tail, his eyes soft and full of love. In that moment, Ethan knew that their story was more than just a tale of survival, it was a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and second chances. Together, they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, ready to embrace whatever the future held. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video to show your support.